Okay, so get this. It's London, 1666. They're just getting over this awful plague.
Oh, yeah, the Great Plague. Brutal.
Right. And then as if things couldn't get worse, this huge fire breaks out. It basically changes London forever. And that's what we're diving into today, the Great Fire of London. We've got some amazing sources to work with.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at this guy, Samuel Pepys.
He actually lived through it all, kept a diary.
Exactly, a first-hand account.
We'll also be looking at Christopher Wren.
Now, he was the architect who redesigned London after the fire, so we'll be able to see how the city was rebuilt.
It all started, though, with a bakery.
A bakery.
Yep, Thomas Farriner's Bakery on Pudding Lane. It's September 2nd. Most of London's asleep, and boom, fire breaks out.
I mean, fires were pretty common back then, right? Weren't they using, like, candles and stuff everywhere?
Yeah, they were. But this one was different.
Okay, so what made this one so different?
Well, you've got to picture London at this time. Basically, a tinderbox waiting to happen.
I've heard about that. Like, all the buildings were made of wood.
Yep. And crammed super close together.
And it was a dry summer, wasn't it?
It was. And super weedy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, basically a recipe for disaster.
Wow. So what about this Samuel Pepys? What did he think about all this?
Well, get this. He actually slept through the whole thing, starting.
No way.
Yeah. When he first wrote about it in his diary, he didn't think much of it. But then as the day went on and he saw how bad it was getting, his tone totally changes.
I bet.
Yeah. He actually ran to the Tower of London to get a better look. And I guess that's when he realized just how big this fire was.
It's one thing to hear about a fire, but to see it firsthand, right?
Right. Coops gives this really vivid account of the whole thing, like everyone panicking, running from their homes, trying to save anything they could. And in the middle of all this, he goes and does something pretty gutsy.
What do you do?
He goes straight to King Charles II.
No way. Just walks up to the king?
Yep. And tells him he needs to do something. Take charge.
Wow. You have to remember that Charles wasn't exactly Mr. Popular at this point.
No, he wasn't. After the plague, he was already struggling. People saw him as this out-of-touch party boy who didn't care about them.
Oh, man. So this fire is a PR nightmare for him on top of everything else.
Exactly. And this is the interesting part, Charles was also a smart politician.
I guess you kind of have to be king.
Yeah. So he realizes this is his chance.
His chance to what? Fix his image?
Yeah, show some leadership. Prove he cares. So he gets right out there, starts organizing everyone, gets involved in fighting the fire himself.
Really? The king was out there fighting the fire?
Totally different from the Lord Mayor. This guy, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. What a mess.
What do you mean?
Well, he was supposed to be in charge, right? But he was totally overwhelmed, couldn't make decisions, refused help, just kept insisting that he could handle it himself.
Oh, man. Talk about being in over your head.
Yeah, it's almost like he was afraid to admit he needed help. So you have the king stepping up, taking charge, and the Lord Mayor just crumbling. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, two totally different leadership styles.
And it's important to remember, this fire was huge, raged for days. The wind just pushed those flames through the city. Can you imagine?
I mean, I've seen pictures and stuff, but yeah, it's hard to grasp how bad it must have been.
People tried everything. Bucket brigades, pulling down buildings to try and stop it from spreading.
That must have been terrifying.
Oh, it was devastating. One of the buildings they lost was St. Paul's Cathedral.
No way. The cathedral burned down.
Yeah, that was a huge blow. It was like the heart of London was gone.
And that's where Christopher Wren comes in.
Exactly. He was brought in to rebuild it. And not just St. Paul's, but to reimagine London itself.
Wren. He had these big ideas for London, like really big.
What kind of ideas?
He wanted to make it like Paris, you know, with those wide streets and all.
Well, like those grand boulevards?
Yeah, exactly. He wanted to completely change London, make it modern, elegant, like a whole new city rising from the ashes.
It's a pretty bold vision.
Oh, it was. But not everyone loved it.
I can imagine. Who wasn't on board?
Well, the king, for one.
King Charles?
Yeah. Wren saw this as a chance to start over. You know, build a city for the future. But Charles was more practical.
Right. You had to think about all the people who had lost everything.
Exactly. Rebuilding was going to be expensive and take forever. And if they had to demolish everything to make way for Wren's big plans, well, that would have been a nightmare.
So Wren's grand vision, it didn't happen.
Not exactly, but he still had a big impact on the rebuilding. Like, he really pushed for fire safety.
That makes sense. After all that destruction.
Yeah. He knew that all those narrow streets and wooden buildings, they were part of the problem. So even though they didn't totally change the street plan, they did make some changes.
Like what?
wider streets, for one, and they started using more brick and stone instead of wood. Plus, they made it easier to get water to fight fires.
I bet those changes made a huge difference.
They did. It was a whole new way of thinking about cities, not just how they look, but how safe they are.
So even though he didn't get to build his dream city, Wren still left his mark on London.
Oh, definitely. And of course, there's St. Paul's Cathedral. That was his masterpiece.
It's amazing. It really does feel like a symbol of London's resilience.
It is. But as grand as St. Paul's is, we can't forget about all the people who suffered because of the fire.
You're right. The people who lost their homes, their businesses.
Exactly. Especially the poor. They were hit the hardest. They lived in the areas that burned the fastest, and they didn't have the resources to rebuild.
It's a reminder that these disasters always impact the most vulnerable the most.
It's true. And the fire, it really exposed just how unequal London was.
So did anything change? I mean, did they try to do anything to address those inequalities?
Yeah, it's amazing to think, right? I mean, a disaster like this could actually lead to some good.
Yeah, it's tragic, of course.
Yeah.
But it kind of forced people to really look at the problems in their city.
Absolutely. The fire, I guess you could say, really brought attention to things like poverty and housing and how dirty the city was.
Okay, so did things actually change? Did they do anything to help the people who were struggling?
Well, it wasn't like a complete revolution or anything, but they did make some improvements.
Like what? What did they do?
Well, for one thing, they started enforcing new building codes, to make sure houses were safer and less likely to catch fire.
That makes sense.
And they put more effort into city planning, tried to make more open spaces and improve the sanitation.
So they really used this as a chance to rethink how the city was built, not just rebuilding the same way.
Right. It's like they had this opportunity, to build back better.
Wren focused on the buildings, but they also had to focus on the people living in those buildings.
Exactly. And while it wasn't perfect, it was a step in the right direction.
It's fascinating how one event can change so much.
It is. The fire forced Londoners to see how vulnerable their city was, but it also showed how creative and resilient they could be.
It makes me think about today. We still deal with a lot of the same issues, like disaster preparedness and how to make cities safer and fairer for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's a fire or a flood or something else, it always brings up these deeper issues.
Right. We can't just rebuild buildings. We have to rebuild communities.
And that's something we can all learn from the Great Fire of London.
Exactly. It's not just a story from the past. It's a reminder for us today.
To learn from our mistakes, to help each other, and to build a better future.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Great Fire, let's keep that in mind. The people who rebuilt London, they showed us what's possible. And that's a story that should inspire us, no matter what challenges we face.
I think that's a great point to end on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story from history.